So it's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Nathan Robbins. I think I first met Nathan about 8 years ago, and it was obvious from the very first meeting that this was somebody who was already doing really important work in Maine, and he was going to be just a really important leader for the future of Maine. He has played an increasingly important leadership role focused on what I would call climate planning and climate action at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. Nathan and I have some things in common. We both got biology degrees a while back, me a lot further back than him. We were both park rangers at various points in our lives. We both had really interesting hands-on experiences as students that really were formative for things we've done since. He got a master's in natural resource management from Antioch. And he has worked all over the state and beyond, certainly here with many faculty and students on this campus, and demonstrated as much as anybody I know, just a dedication to strengthening these kinds of collaborations. He's a climate change specialist at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. He works closely with the commissioner of DEP, who is herself a student from the University of Maine and has spoken in this room in the past. He not only has a deep knowledge of what's happening in Maine, but what's happening all over the country. He has been a coordinator with Harper Gassett in this room and others of the University of Maine's Maine Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network. I just think of it as CCAP, but it has a full name, as it turns out. He's not just a coordinator, he's a really outstanding source of energy, passion, and insight, a kind of sustainability glue. So you're going to find out quickly that he's also someone who really believes in building the kind of relationships it's going to take to do this work, which is something that's important at the Mitchell Center as well. So we're kindred spirits in that sense. The title of his talk includes that language. Part of it is the importance of relationships in climate action. Please join me in welcoming Nathan.
Wow, David, thank you so much. That was so kind in the introduction. I will do my best to deliver here. And it's good to see everyone today, and to those online. Thank you for joining us. It's really wonderful to be here and especially to be talking about this particular topic at the Mitchell Center, which is a beacon for this type of work. And it's especially wonderful to work together as the Mitchell Center that's so supportive to DEP on our climate work over the years. Coming to speak today, I was certainly a little bit apprehensive about this topic because I'm speaking about relationships with others, and certainly I can't speak for them, but it's really nice to know that there's interest in this type of thinking and work. I've certainly been appreciative of and on the receiving end of a lot of colleagues over the years being very open to collaborating, and I think that's sort of the glue that helps make it work. It's difficult to quantify or to talk about how someone else feels, and so you know, I'm going to speak a little bit about some examples that I think highlight what this looks like. Why relationships matter in climate action. And I just needed there we go.
Yeah. That going down?
Here we go. Yeah, I get it. Let's try that. Okay. So on that first question about who's on first, I think it's really implementing climate action plans is really complex. Addressing climate change in general is complex, and because it's so pervasive, that call to action really lands on everyone. It's a multidisciplinary subject. It requires lots of people to be involved. And the answer to the question, I think, about who's on first is really anyone and everyone. What's equally important, though, I think, is the enabling conditions for a person or a group of people to make change. My thinking is that relationships are really, again, one of the greatest resources for action. And again, the examples I'm going to speak to today, I think, are just a piece of the pie, but and the ones that I've been involved with, but there are so many others that I maybe you all have been involved with that may simplify this. To me, the examples are really about individuals and groups stepping up to take action. The power of consensus-based decision making, and that climate change again requires this long-term, multi-generation call to action. And it's that trust, the accountability, and social capital that comes from relationships that I think provides the sustainability needed to meet that call to action. So again, who's on first is really about anyone and everyone, but I think they're maximized potential by the enabling conditions that allows change makers to work together. So here's a picture of me early on, just as a bit of context to how I got involved with all of this. You know, from an early age, I had a strong relationship with the environment, probably like many of you. I was outside all the time. I was visiting my parks in my town. I was getting on my bike and trying to get as many of them together as I can in one, you know, big adventure. When I got to college, I was studying biology, and I got the advice from a friend to apply to an internship with the State Park Service in Massachusetts. And I had a really wonderful mentor who taught me all about practical things like maintaining parks and, you know, cutting grass and things like that, but also about the importance of partnerships and how important that is in the environmental sector to getting things done. So he taught me a lot about that. And actually, after college, it turned into a job. I got hired by DCR, and I spent 3 years working for them. And it was a dream. It was the dream job. I got to work as a park ranger. I got to be outdoors about 6 months out of the year, living outside. I got to lead cultural and natural history tours, and I got to work with lots of other passionate individuals. And of course, all of the things that were wonderful also began, you know, I began to think about, you know, challenges like how complex these issues that I was seeing out in the world were, that I was talking about in these tours, were going to be to solve. The sea level was rising, channels were getting faster, causing more erosion. I'm standing on top of a bluff, and I'm at a historic resource that was starting to erode into the ocean. Then there was this wind turbine presenting opportunities about maybe a lower carbon future. And the sunsets were also really, really good. So I didn't know if I wanted to be in public service, but certainly by the end of that, I was pretty sold on it. So getting to where the work that I'm doing currently at DEP, you know, putting this into focus of the work that we have underway. The first thing that we had as an overall goal was to incorporate climate into the work that we did, to develop this thing called the climate lens, which is really about, you know, asking people, you know, how does climate change fit into the work that you are doing? And so for us, it was the projects that we were working on, the programs that we were administering, the initiatives that we were working on, whether they were existing, whether there were things that we could take on that were new, and where was that lens that we could add so that everything that we were working on, the outcomes were more sustainable and resilient. And so using sort of good sustainability principles, we made a team. So it started with me and our sustainability director at the time, and we had liaisons from each of our bureaus, so there were 4 of them, and then our commissioner was providing support and direction. And we asked people, we sent out a survey. What are the climate change concerns that you're seeing? Is your program addressing climate change, and how? And what's needed? So we really started with listening. But of course, a lot of people were already doing great work. We're really fortunate at DEP to have really dedicated, passionate individuals who've been working for decades on this subject. So they had a lot of ideas, and that the importance of listening to them and trying to respond was, I think, really helpful to building that social capital that we were going to need to take action on the things that they wanted to do. And one of the things that we also wanted to make sure we were focusing on was being proactive. So borrowing a lesson from emergency management was know your risk, have a plan in place before a disaster strikes. So by starting to ask people now, what is it that you need? What are the gaps? What are the starting points? We were able to start to sort of look for some early opportunities. For DEP, and I'm just borrowing this framework from the Gulf of Maine Council on the Marine Environment, our work sort of fits into different parts of this puzzle. So sort of in the bottom part on the state of the environment and the impacts, we have lots of monitoring programs that are working on air quality and water quality, and they help sort of reveal environmental trends over time, which is really important when it comes to climate change. And then we have programs like regulatory and funding programs and technical assistance programs that really get at the driving forces and the pressures and those responses to both reduce the rate of change and ultimately the impacts that are occurring. So we looked for some early opportunities for how we could incorporate this climate lens. In 2014, the Maine voters passed the Maine Water Bond, and that included funding for a new stream crossing grant program for municipalities in Maine. That was an opportunity to think about climate change. Municipalities are commonly thinking about culverts as an infrastructure to improve, especially with respect to hydrology, this passage, and also public safety. And so we included in our criteria for how we've evaluated projects, climate change in terms of improved public safety funding. And that program has actually continued through multiple transportation bonds and now funding through the Maine Jobs and Recovery Program. And then, as you can see on that map, it covers, there's been culverts improved throughout the state.
Just click off that black bar at the top there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll cross at the end of it. There you go. Yeah. Sorry, it's a new thing.
No trouble. Another opportunity was our bureau director in water actually approached our climate group and said, we're seeing a lot of concerns about wastewater utilities. We have a lot of concerns about flooding. We're hearing from superintendents. Actually, at the time, they had an intern who surveyed the superintendents down in southern Maine. And from those responses, we learned that almost 91% of them had been impacted by extreme weather, that half of them about had been doing something to protect against that weather, that extreme weather or climate. But none of them had actually put climate into their annual budget, but about 2/3 were interested in doing so. And so that seemed like a real opportunity about being proactive and what could DEP do to help them do that. So we developed a loan principal forgiveness program, which essentially functions like a grant for up to $20,000 to allow them to, as an incentive program to develop these adaptation plans. And that could help prioritize their projects. And then they could then use the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which is where the incentive program comes from, for a low interest loan to then make those improvements. In 2015, we'd actually made this first go at creating the Maine Climate Hub, which was a centralized clearinghouse on climate information and decision support information. And that really brought us into the community resilience space and getting requests for assistance. In hearing those, there was a big interest to raise awareness about flooding and other types of impacts in communities. We're a member of this Maine Silver Jackets team, which is a federal, state, and local partnership. It's led by the Army Corps of Engineers, our state floodplain management program, and it's really municipality driven in terms of the projects. So there's several examples, but one of them that we worked on was this high watermark project, and so that was about bringing together, those with expertise on the data and the science, but also municipalities were really interested in having additional voices come to the table and support them. And so these signs, that blue part on the bottom shows sort of where the historic flooding was, but then the red shows where future flooding could be, given sea level rise scenarios. So as an opportunity to raise awareness, and then in turn potentially support, for other adaptation projects. Sort of looking at it in a different perspective. So those were some of the things you could see in sort of DEP, and then some with our other partners through the Silver Jackets. Here's another example of how interagency coordination that we've been involved with. So that's just another role that DEP has played in the past, is convening this interagency coordination, which this group was called the Maine Interagency Climate Adaptation Work Group. And we began this in 2013 through a previous work group. It later expanded to called the Environment and Energy Resources Work Group. It later expanded to MICA, which had 9 agencies or offices, departments, and there were liaisons. So it was an information sharing collaborative, and really it was about raising awareness of the resources and technical assistance that the state already had available. And we brought together leads, as mentioned, across those agencies. And many were actually working on climate already. So, for example, DOT had an adaptation plan already that they were working on. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife had was in the process of incorporating climate into the State Wildlife Action Plan. CDC had developed, or the Center for Disease Control similarly had an action plan. MEMA, or the Maine Emergency Management Agency, had the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, and they were considering adding climate. So there were some of these agencies already were working on climate in a big way and had a plan, and others were interested in sort of making climate a bigger part of their work. So it was information sharing, but it was also projects. We developed the framework for the current Maine Climate Hub, and as a place to sort of highlight available resources and technical assistance. And that was really about supporting others incorporate this climate lens. And we developed, reports about these inventories in 2014, 18, and 19. And we were really fortunate to have Jamie Haberkamp at the time, who was an IGERT fellow in 2017, who did, among many other projects, one which was about indicator-based evaluation and monitoring and assessment, which I think was really a formative report that towards indicators and then sort of later evolutions of a climate dashboard. So we're really appreciated Jamie's hard work on that, and many other projects at the time. This has another example, is the Maine Community Resilience Workbook. This, I think, really speaks to the concerted effort by many individual and group actors over time. In the 2010 adaptation plan, there was this idea that we needed a clearinghouse of information and a workbook for communities to really be able to put together all the pieces on how to start a municipal climate initiative, how to do assessment and planning. and how to really integrate this work into their day-to-day operations. And all of the data, the financial resources, the technical assistance, and peer-to-peer opportunities to make that possible. Well, a couple of years ago, with great support from the Nature Conservancy and the Mitchell Center, that really pushed that process forward in sort of a new way. And a team came together, and we worked with the Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network, with regional planning organizations, with state agencies, with municipalities on developing sort of a broader framework, and to put out this initial version of the Community Resilience Workbook. And it's sort of part of a broader statewide effort, I think, to develop, again, this sort of updated clearinghouse and guidance, and then training to allow people to exchange both ideas and transfer lessons, and so we expedite their municipal climate work. So I'm just going to pause for a minute to take stock at sort of a higher level. Those were just some individual and sort of group actions, but just in the context of the state climate plan sort of writ large. The first climate action plan in Maine was in 2004, and it set our greenhouse gas reduction goals. In 2009, the university led the first impact for the state of Maine, the Climate Future 2009 report that has been updated several times. And in 2010, there was an adaptation plan that was directly informed by that assessment in 2009. The state hazard mitigation plan for the first time included climate change in 2018. And then sort of as a sort of culminating point, I think sort of pulling together all of these different subject matters, for really the first time in our work in Maine on climate, the Maine Won't Wait 2020 Climate Action Plan was really cross-disciplinary and bringing everybody together in one conversation. So I'm just going to present just a bit of data here, which I think speaks to the power of relationships in these collective and individual actions over time. So going into sort of 2019, at the end of that period and before we got to Maine Won't Wait in 2020, we took stock and said, what is it where are we at with these plans? So of the 54 recommendations in the climate action plan, we'd implemented in some either partially or made significant evidence of progress on over 70% of them. And there were a couple left. There was HFCs and appliance standards. There were others, but those ones I'm just pulling out because they were shown to see significant emissions reductions at the time, but they were still on the to-do list. And this is what that looked like on our emissions. And I think if you can see the high point there in 2002, but going into sort of 2019, into 2018, we reduced our emissions 33%, hit our 2010 goal, and on track to hit our 2020 goal. This is what that looked like in our most recent report. And a couple of things to point out. One, the overall line moved up. So thanks to some really great work done at the university to put together the state's carbon budget for the first time. And I think through the consensus-based process of developing the plan in the first place, there was real interest to incorporate biomass into the emissions that previously was not part of our calculation. So we also codified our long-term goal. And I think one of the big parts to me is that while all models are maybe not right, or you can argue for the different reasons why this all happened. What really sticks out to me is that once we hit that high point and the state started doing climate action planning, that's when the emission reduction started going down. And I think there's been incredible inertia on that ever since. And again, by the collective sort of efforts of individual in-group actions, and I think enabled in large part by those planning processes that built that trust. Or in other words, the people who came together to make those plans then left and did the hard work of implementation, and they actually did what they said they were going to do. And I think that's really evidenced here in this analysis. One other project, just pause real quick, that I'm excited about right now is, what is the underlying science and what is the data that we make our decisions on? Well, in that last slide, we added the carbon budget to the way that we were doing our greenhouse gas inventory. Well, we're working on a pilot project right now about our emissions globally, not just in the state of Maine. So that last figure is really our emissions in the state of Maine. But what keeps coming up in our climate action planning process, both in the ones in the early 2000s and the most recent one was, well, what about all the emissions that we as consumers make that are from products that we're consuming globally? Well, there is a way to look at that. And so we're now working on putting together the first consumption-based emissions inventory for the state of Maine. And we anticipate having those initial results later this year. So I think this is another area of work that will, there's going to be lots of opportunity to continue to collaborate and work together on as we begin to see what this looks like for Maine and what those solutions are, because the responses to the figure of greenhouse gas emissions that we form are largely based on what the data that goes into it. So if we add new data into that, then we might wind up generating additional solutions that fill out another part of that puzzle. In 2010, adaptation plan, similarly, we'd actually completed or shown evidence of progress on over 80% of our emissions. There was a coalition of partners that was maintained over that time. I mentioned the indicators and dashboard work previously. And one of the things that was called for that was needed on the to-do list was this networked interactions. But I think sort of as a sort of overall point on this, I think that these plans really demonstrate that planning processes, the people who are part of them, builds a lot of social capital. And through that, that relationship building, that social capital is the potential energy that then ultimately is what makes implementing the plan possible. And I think there's an expanding and sort of contracting role happening here where we're planning and then we're implementing. And the implementing really takes a lot of hard work. And it actually, in many cases, instead of working inward towards a common goal of a plan, we're now working outwards and implementing with a broader set of partners. And that brings in great opportunities. And I just need to pause because I need to thank Victor Dankins, who was a Maine government summer intern in 2019 with us, and he did a lot of that hard work to make all of that analysis possible. So coming into 2019, there was a lot of inertia towards climate action in the state. We had an adaptation plan, we had an action plan. At the agency levels, there was individual leads and there were teams being created. There was sort of a roundtable being formed around interagency coordination. And the Climate Council really is a big tent, ultimately. It brings those disciplines together and those actors together into one conversation, and it's long term again. So it's sort of meeting that call to action about climate change where it has reduction, we have reduction goals out to 2050, and the council continues to update its climate action plan every 4 years. And I think it's sort of through that we have real potential for continued relationship building and expanding that and creating that network relationships that I think the 2010 adaptation plan really called for. For example, I think we really start to say we're achieving that. So this is the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan. There's 8 strategy areas. There's lots of action areas underneath each. This was released in December 1st, 2020. You've probably heard about it. I'm not going to go into the whole plan. I'm just going to focus a little bit on the DEP parts and just give it an example that we're working on right now. So that was really about the past and how I think relationships have really, and this work of groups and these enabling conditions of the plans have really been demonstrated the success. Going forward, I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue that work. So just delving in a little bit on this one strategy area F, we're actively working on implementing a number of the actions, but just to pick out adopting of official sea level rise projections. We had a 2022 deadline for that, and to update land use planning and legal tools for resilience was a 2024. These to me also really fit in, I think, with this climate ready infrastructure. Or in other words, incorporating climate into the way that our land use regulations are creates the enabling conditions for resilient infrastructure. So in 2022, well, actually really in 2021, as this resolve to charge the state agencies, several of them, to come together and analyze how we could incorporate sea level rise into our regulations and into the laws. Where was the change needed? That report was delivered on January 1st of 2022, and just to pull out one finding was that each agency will need to tackle specific legal and technical questions and to work with stakeholders who have interest and expertise in those specific areas. So while there was changes that could be made that were identified in law, or there was a number that were identified in several different regulations that agencies administered. So for DEP, we have several on that list. And when I read that, each agency will tackle specific legal questions and work with additional stakeholders. We know that there's a lot of opportunity and need to work with additional stakeholders to really understand what changes are needed to those regulations and where. And so we began this resilient infrastructure research project last year with great support from the Mitchell Center, and we've hired Melissa Genoder, who's a current UMaine student, and we began scoping this project back in spring last year, and we kicked off the internship in October, right here, actually, with our project team. And we began agency discussions about what they were thinking about resilient infrastructure. We had the idea that, again, in order to sort of build resilient infrastructure in the landscape, their role for DEP was to look at our regulations and our guidance and the assistance that we were providing. But we really needed to go back to this. We need to listen first. Sort of similar with the other processes of our internal climate group, ask the questions first, find what the needs are, generate the list together, build those relationships, build that social capital, and then start to work on that list collectively together. Now, we didn't have all of the capacities that we needed to really investigate this. And having Melissa and this team, this sort of interdisciplinary team to come together and start to really generate these questions and start to ask both folks at DEP and our partner agencies, and starting to work with external partners, municipal representatives, folks in the engineering community in Maine, and designers who are building these structures. What are you seeing in terms of the regulatory constructs? How's it working for you? What are the improvements that are needed? We've started to get identify some of the potential areas where we might want to be moving forward. Really excited because we have our participatory workshop with all of the participants tomorrow. So there will be a lot more to come, and we'll be getting together our final report. But really, and then that next step is further developing those findings with those stakeholders and exploring the opportunities for continued partnerships. Going back to the plan, this is a subset of things that DEP is engaged with on implementing. And you'll see a lot of timelines there. There's a few I spoke to. Right at the top, HFC phase down regulations and appliance standards. They were on the to-do list from 2004. The climate action planning process brought those back up towards the top of the list, and we've actually are implementing those now. The bottom of the list, sea level rise projections, updated land use regulations. I've talked a bit about those. The state leadership for technical assistance, a little bit about those. So those are just a few that I wanted to pull off the list, but again, there are many more. And going back to the sort of expanding and contracting needs and opportunities, I wouldn't look at the deadlines and say, we're done. In many ways, the train has left the station, and the hard work is really going to come. And I feel like that's the real opportunity for continued work together. And we've been really fortunate to work with the university on key areas over the years. I pulled out 3 different internships over the years that have each sort of advanced the conversation that we've been having. And I don't think we could have done it without their support. But the sort of topic, the name for my topic really came from this. So I can't end without it. This is the Maine Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network. It's a peer-to-peer network of adaptation professionals in Maine. We meet with a similar network in New Hampshire. We share lessons. And one of those is that adaptation happens at the speed of trust. And I'm just always reminded of that when I think about relationships, the glue. And I will put right that with that another phrase that I've heard, which is the truth is faster. And I think we need to think about expediting our solutions. And speaking honestly and openly is a really good way to do that. I think that's possible through strong relationships. And when we have the enabling conditions of planning processes and creating an atmosphere where we can encourage others and empower others to act, and have those change makers really be able to work together, that's how we're going to get to where we need to go. So thanks so much. Happy to take questions.
So I think what's going to happen next is that Jessica Janswitz, who's a senior faculty fellow here at the Mention Center, is going to come on the screen. There she is. Hi, Jessica. And so she's going to facilitate things that have come in the chat and any other ideas she has that she wants to discuss, and I'll be here in the room. And so if there are things that in our audience right here and that people want to talk about, get my attention, and I'll try to call on you and take it away, Jessica.
Sounds good. Well, first, I hope you'll all join me in thanking Nathan. That was a wonderful talk, and I think a really great way to kick off the Mitchell Center's sustainability talks this spring, because Nathan, you really do exemplify a leader who's really taking sort of your energy and your passion and your insight to helping to tackle some of these sustainability problems, and really focusing on things that we really care a lot about here at the Mitchell Center, that David really talked about in his introduction, about strengthening partnerships between communities and universities and weaving in different types of knowledge. So I found that really exciting. And I think we're getting a few questions here in the chat. So I'll go to those. And I think there was one that came in while you were talking, Nathan, and I really appreciated how you drew on looking at individual and group actions and a lot of examples. And you talked about partnerships and how they can look really differently in different contexts in varying degrees. And you talked a little bit about training and information, but you also talked about funding sources. And there was a quick question, I guess, for clarification. I think this came up in the Silver Jacket program you were talking about. And if you can just say a couple of words perhaps about some of the funding programs, and if I guess there was some clarity whether it was in related to DEP internally, or if some of those opportunities and partnerships might be available to those outside of DEP.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so yes, the topic of funding, of course, is one I'm expecting people were listening to. You know, how do we get it done? So the Silver Jackets program is a federal program. It's led by the Army Corps of Engineers. They can provide assistance funding to non-structural flood risk reduction measures. So things like raising awareness of flood risk through the High Water Mark project is one of those. We also are working on a project about flood risk reduction measures for historic properties. We've developed a dynamic inundation map for Portland, South Portland, and Damariscotta. So they are working on the sort of information to enable risk assessments and planning, and sort of looking at the designs that you would need to build that resilience. That's a federal program. Around this time, really every year, like basically March, I think we submit proposals to the Army Corps. They're generated by the group of partners, so municipalities who are interested would say, this is the project we want to work on, great, and then we see if we can get the capacity of the state and federal partners together. So it's really a true partnership and collaboration, but it's really about meeting community needs. DEP has several different funding programs. I only spoke to just a couple of them. One was the Stream Crossing Grant Program. That's come through bond funding and also through the COVID recovery funds. That improves municipal culverts. And so we put, there's a lot of information on our website about that, about the timing of when those RFPs are, materials to use to help applications. And I will say John McLean is sort of leads that program and is just an excellent resource and available to contact him. Another one was the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. So that's the sort of for primarily wastewater infrastructure, although there are some other projects that are eligible through CWSRF. Brandy Pierce leads that program for us. She's also excellent and available. And we have a DEP grants and loans page, and you could go there, and happy to help be a liaison to connect to those other places.
Great,
Hey,
thank you.
Jessica.
Yeah.
Jessica, could we take turns here and I call on somebody and then get back to you?
Yes.
Great. So over front row, can you speak up, please?
Sure, thanks. I thought it was really interesting how you were talking about the social capital and trust piece that you built during the planning process. can you say anything else about enabling conditions that you were talking about? Like what exactly do you think helped to make that happen, like, in the Maine process in particular?
I'm glad you asked me for finer points on that. So I think there are many enabling conditions. Some are hard to quantify. So one that I think is really important is who's at the table. And again, making a big tent, I think, was really, really productive for advancing climate solutions. And the Climate Council, I think, really helps embody what that could look like with different working groups, having sort of peers or people in the same topic, natural and working lands, community resilience, or public health, you know, working together to solve, you know, identify the challenges and the solutions. But one is time. Another one is consensus-based processes. All of the state climate plans have been developed by consensus-based processes. So when determining sort of how decisions were going to be made within the Climate Council, it was easy to look back at those previous plans and see their success and be able to say, okay, this is a really productive way to get people to build those relationships. So time, consensus-based solutions, big tent, lots of people involved. And another thing, I think we were actually really fortunate to have incredible staff who helped make this possible was the sort of asynchronous opportunities to be involved. So the pandemic happened when we were in the middle of the planning process, and we actually were able to sort of shift online. And so since and during, we've had this hybrid opportunity where people could come in and participate really from wherever they were at different points of time. And so it's not just time in terms of, you know, giving the planning process time, but expanding the way we think about time by giving people opportunity to come in at different points.
So Jessica, I'm going to turn it back to you for a bit.
Okay, thank you, David. So Nathan, I just want to point out you're getting a lot of accolades in the chat. Many people appreciating your talk, and I just want to point out, at least on my screen, all the colleagues from many different disciplines and up and down the coast. There's a lot of interest in what you're doing, and I will point out there's from different sectors. So we had some questions about land trusts and how they get involved, and I want to point out Ruth did put in the chat a link to the DEP grants and loans page that you mentioned. So that perhaps might be one helpful resource. Another question that came in was sort of making the connection between sustainable fisheries and climate change, and wondering what types of work you're doing there to address those issues, along with building trust in the fishing community, and if you've done any partnerships and work in strengthening that area.
So I'm not working directly on that as closely as I think other colleagues within our department are, and certainly my mind first goes straight to the marine working group of the Climate Council. So certainly from the sort of community resilience part of our work, I think you know, sort of thinking about the connecting groups that are sort of coming up with sort of the, you know, things like diversification. And I don't want to talk too much about it because it's really not my expertise, but I guess the role that we have within the community resilience work is probably best played through like CCAP or through the community resilience workbook, and just trying to connect peers together. But I'm sorry I can't be a little bit more helpful to that particular person's question.
No, that's fine. And perhaps we can find some resources to connect that person to some resources. And I guess if you wanted to say a word or two about connecting with land trusts and some opportunities there before we hand it back to the room.
Sure. So again, another group I don't work as directly with, but certainly from my previous work as well. Open spaces and play a huge opportunity within the climate sort of resilience space. I think certainly within people getting out and even just accessing the outdoors is really important to that, creating that bond. Forests, of course, play a major role in sequestration. There's also, thinking about vulnerable areas and sort of how can, so for example, in our resilient infrastructure work right now, open spaces have come up in terms of nature-based solutions to say like flooding. Is there an opportunity that open spaces play within overall community resilience? I have lots of, I certainly love to be outdoors, so I could go on about that one and the value of open spaces, educational opportunities to promote communities coming together through open spaces and building relationships. So, but I won't go on too much longer about that one.
Thank you. David, I didn't know if there were more questions in the room.
And just, I think it's 2 weeks from now, but maybe it's 3. Tim Glidden will be speaking here. And he is both worked for state government with Land for Maine's Futures way back. And then for more than a decade was the director of the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is just a leading land trust and has been for a long time. So it'll be some of these questions like string together across different presentations. It'll be interesting to see what Tim has to say. But we do have a question farther back. Can you speak up, please, Austin?
Yes, I was wondering, you talked about global thought, like came out of your work, like you guys like expanded broader and broader. Have you do you have any connections with any kind of organizations who are working globally?
That's a really good question. I mean, most of my focus these days is on Maine, but I think in terms of sort of the peer-to-peer, I do participate on various groups that are national or even some international groups too. One is Maine's a member of the U.S. Climate Alliance, so they convene a lot of different work groups. And through our direct sort of federal agency, EPA, they actually hold a regional climate group. So I think there are great opportunities to sort of share lessons. It's always good to be able to connect with somebody who's working on something really similar to you, because you can pick up right where each other are at and talk about, just start that relationship and start to be able, being open to sharing the resources and ideas it's been enormously helpful. Coming up with, models and frameworks of like, so you're not doing it first. What are the transferable lessons? Another one was, actually Maine had some really early climate action work done through a group called the New England Governors and Eastern Canadian Premiers. It was the first climate action plan developed at that sort of multi-jurisdictional international level between the 6 New England states and the 5 Eastern Canadian provinces. That climate action plan was created in 2001, and it was enormously informative to our climate action plans that then followed in 2003 and 2004 with the legislation. And in fact, the goals, the reduction goals, were very similar as well. So, so it's sort of up and down. Always thinking about Maine, but I think there's certainly like sort of a collegial, peer-to-peer network. People have been really open to sharing and working together.
Jess, anything else from your end?
Yeah, I have one more question here if we have time. Nathan, you talked about some of the enabling conditions for partnerships, 2 of them being trust and this consensus-based process. And we had a question in the chat about providing a little more insight in the consensus-based process and maybe any challenges you might have faced where perhaps not everybody was on board, and you had a lot of differing opinions, and how you really worked through that consensus based process.
Yeah, it certainly it's not easy, right? And that's why it's called consensus based. It's you know it's I think, you know, I was involved in parts of it, so I don't want to speak writ large, but I think there are always things that sort of come up that you are easy or easier. Everyone agrees. There's the things that are, we can probably do this. And then there's the things that are maybe not right now, but let's not lose that. And I think that's also part of the climate conversation, because again, it's a long-term call to action. So even if there wasn't an opportunity to work on it right now, maybe that was bandwidth. You know, it could have been as simple as we don't necessarily have the capacity, or maybe we don't have the data. Maybe we need to go explore and get more data. And I guess all of those, again, create opportunities for continued work together. And with this particular climate action planning process being updated every 4 years, I think it does create an opportunity to revisit those. It's built into the process. The council keeps going, the groups keep going, the plan keeps getting updated. And so if you can't reach consensus right away, you're not washing your hands and walking away. You're going to come back together at the table.
Hey, Jess, I got one last one, and then I think we'll close.
Sounds good.
So I just had a question. I know that you had mentioned in the beginning, you were kind of talking about like in the title, like trying to define who's on first. And you kind of had said that every person and everyone is kind of responsible for their impacts and what they do in this process. But I was just kind of wondering, like, what can we do as individuals in our community to kind of further this process and kind of make it go forward cleaner?
That is such a great question. I really appreciate it. They've all been great. And I wish I answered some of them better. So I'll go back and take my notes and do better next time. The question was about about individual actions and what can we individually do in our own communities, I think. For me, I'm always thinking about my personal consumption. I'm not sure that that's the highest priority for everybody, but I do think a lot about what I do, you know, what I buy and what I don't buy, and think about the waste hierarchy and think about the fact that, you know, reduction is at the top, and then reuse and then recycle, and work your way down the list. For me, that makes I think about that a lot and how I, you know, buy things and food and things like that. The other thing I think that's enormously important that I learned early on in parks, and I spent a lot of time thinking about Frederick Law Olmsted and how parks are spaces to bring people together. You know, I think that this is a topic where we need to come together. So, you know, finding even just a neighborhood organization is really a great place to start. Let alone like moving up to sort of the other, you know, town council meeting or something like that. But I think it never hurts to get involved if you want to get involved, you know, and there's always more work to be done. And I think leaders especially, are looking for people to step up. It really helps them too. Just a few ideas.
So this conversation not only could go on, it will go on, but we'll pause for this particular afternoon. I want to thank Nathan for reminding us, just not only in his own work, but in the ideas he shared for all of us. There's plenty to be done, and there's a lot of value, both for ourselves and for the world, to kind of roll up our sleeves, which I did, but I think it's because I was getting hot in here. And looking forward to, I think, many more opportunities to not only learn from Nathan and his colleagues, but also join forces with them. So thanks so much.